Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you to community members and the media for joining us here this morning for our virtual news conference. First, I wish to express gratitude that we are here on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and to pay respect to the long history and enduring contributions of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of this land. Also, the Ontario Human Rights Commission wishes to acknowledge the current global imperative to combat systemic racism. The Commission stands with Black communities across Ontario in confronting and condemning anti-Black racism, often experienced through pernicious racial profiling. Today, the Commission is releasing its second interim report, A Disparate Impact, as part of its ongoing inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black people by the Toronto Police Service. Concerns about anti-Black racism in policing in Toronto have persisted for over 4 decades. We must remember the names of the many Black lives that decade after decade have tragically ended in the hands of police in Toronto. People like, for example, Buddy Evans in 1978, Lester Donaldson in 1988, Albert Moses in 1994, Alexander Mannon in 2010, and Andrew Loco in 2015, and the many more that we have lost in between. We are deeply concerned when a police response to a 911 call for help because someone is distraught results in death, as was the recent case with Regis Korchinski-Paquette. We remember the hundreds of protesters who marched in 1988, and we see the thousands upon thousands of protesters who march today. I, as well as the Commission's team, and to a larger extent, many Ontarians, appreciate the commitment and hard work and sacrifices of the members of the TPS who go to work every day for us. In our work at the Commission, we respect and acknowledge how complex, demanding, and difficult the job of frontline policing truly is. In 2017, when we launched this inquiry into racial profiling, the goal was, and still is, to build trust between Black communities and the Toronto Police by empirically studying the issues to pinpoint the problem areas and by making strong recommendations to address the root causes of the problems. We retained renowned criminologist Dr. Scott Wortley to assist with this inquiry, and his expert analysis and insight formed a major component of our first interim report called A Collective Impact, released in December 2018. The findings in A Collective Impact were very troubling and continue to garner public attention to this day. Recently, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized the Commission's work in A Collective Impact as highly authoritative. The report contained Dr. Wortley's analysis of data obtained by the Commission from the province's Special Investigations Unit. Among other things, Dr. Wortley found that between 2013 and 2017, a Black person was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be a victim of a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police Service. A Collective Impact also included the results of our broad consultation with Black communities across Toronto. It documented the pervasive and painful experiences of Black communities in their interactions with the police. Today, the Commission's second interim report, A Disparate Impact, we release findings that expose chronic concerns related to policing practices. The report's results are highly disturbing and confirm what Black communities have said for decades, that Black people bear a disproportionate burden of law enforcement. The Commission and Dr. Wortley's research is clear and convincing that Black people are more likely to be charged, overcharged, and more likely to be arrested by Toronto Police. And Black people are more likely to be struck, shot, or killed by Toronto Police. These findings demonstrate the urgent need to concretely address racial inequities, to regain community trust, and to institute meaningful and binding changes that will transform policing and end suffering. Ontarians often express the view that racial disparities in police use of force in Toronto is not as serious as in the United States. However, Dr. Wortley's research reveals a different picture, a picture that compels us to stop perpetuating this myth. Specifically, the likelihood of a Black person being shot by police in Toronto is just as high as for a Black person in the average city in the United States. The time for debate about whether systemic racism or anti-Black racism exists is over. The time has come to work together to change law enforcement institutions and systems that produce such disparate outcomes. Community trust and safety, especially the safety of Black lives, depend on it. The report's findings cannot be ignored, and that is why I am here on behalf of the Commission today to present our 2 calls for action. First, we call on the Toronto Police Service, the Toronto Police Services Board, and the City of Toronto to formally establish a process for Black communities, Black organizations, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission to adopt and implement legally binding remedies that will result in fundamental shifts in practices and culture of policing, and address and eliminate systemic racism and anti-Black racial bias in policing. The Commission has commenced this dialogue with the Toronto Police Service and the Toronto Police Services Board and the City. The Board and the Toronto Police Service have told us they are open to working with the Commission and with communities to explore a process for fashioning solutions. We hope that these discussions will result in a holistic and structural changes that will ensure accountability through broad, legally binding solutions. I informed the Toronto Police Service, the Board, and the City that to promote positive change, Black communities must be engaged at every step of the process. That's why the Commission has commenced and will continue to engage with Black communities in these discussions to ensure that their lived experiences are reflected in the final outcomes of legally binding remedies. Second, we call on the Government of Ontario to establish a legislative and/or regulatory framework to directly address systemic racism and anti-Black racist bias in policing. Provincial law must mandate all police services in Ontario to collect and analyze comprehensive, disaggregate data, race-based data, across a full spectrum of policing services and activities in order to provide a transparent and effective accountability processes and mechanisms to ensure that police officers who engage in racial profiling and discrimination are effectively dealt with. We look forward to productively working with the province on this second call for action. In closing, given the magnitude of the data of the Commission's second interim report, it is incumbent upon us all to re-envision the practices, the policies, the procedures, and importantly, the perceptions that shape policing in our city. The disproportionalities and the disparities in the Commission's report are more than just statistics. They are Black lives, and Black lives matter. Thank you. I will now invite Raj Deer, the Commission's Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel, who has worked tirelessly with the Commission's research team to provide an overview of the report's finding and the next steps in our inquiry.
Thank you, Interim Chief Commissioner Chadha. A disparate impact includes two new research reports from our expert, Dr. Wortley, an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Centre for Criminology and Sociological Studies, and his research team. The first report examines racial disparities in charges and arrests between 2013 and 2017. Focusing on offenses which involve significant police discretion, it examines how race can affect charge, arrest, and post-arrest decisions. The second report is a deeper dive into the 2013 to 2017 Special Investigations Unit data analyzed in a collective impact, and an analysis of lower-level use of force between 2016 and 2017. Lower-level use of force is force that may not reach the threshold of serious injury, death, or allegations of sexual assault required to engage the Special Investigation Unit's mandate, but may still result in serious physical and emotional impacts. Now, you'll be hearing from Dr. Wortley in a few moments. First, I'm going to highlight a few significant findings in each of these reports. Looking at the report on racial disparities in arrests and charges, Dr. Wortley found that Black people were grossly overrepresented in discretionary lower-level charges. For example, although they represent only 8.8% of the Toronto's population, Black people represented almost 1/3 of all charges in the charge data set. By contrast, white people and people from other racialized groups were underrepresented. Black people represented more than 1/3 of people involved in single charge, out-of-sight driving offenses, such as driving without a valid insurance. These are charges that can never be discovered until police have observed the race of the driver or stopped and questioned the individual. By contrast, white people and people from other racialized groups were underrepresented. Black people represented almost 4 in 10 people involved in cannabis charges, despite the fact that conviction rates and many studies from across the United States and Canada show that Black people use cannabis at similar rates to white people and people from other racialized groups. White people and people from other racialized groups were underrepresented in these charges. And interestingly, only 1 in 5 charges, regardless of race, resulted in conviction. However, charges against Black people were more likely to result in a withdrawal of charges and less likely to result in a conviction than those involving white people. Given the disproportionate rates of charging and the impacts on Black people and communities, these low conviction rates raise systemic concerns about charging practices. Turning now to the use of force report. Black people were significantly overrepresented in Special Investigations Unit's use of force cases and grossly overrepresented in lower-level use of force cases that resulted in physical injury, such as bruises or lacerations, but did not rise to the level of the Special Investigations Unit threshold. This overrepresentation cannot be explained by factors such as patrol zones in low crime and high crime neighborhoods, violent crime rates, and/or average income. Black people were more likely to be involved in use of force cases that involved proactive policing. For example, when an officer decides to stop and question someone. Then reactive policing. For example, when the police respond to a call for assistance. In contrast, a significantly larger percentage of more serious and lower level use of force cases involving white people resulted from reactive policing. The data from these two reports tells us that Black communities are subjected to a disproportionate burden of law enforcement in a way that is consistent with systemic racism and anti-Black racial bias. Now, when we are talking about systemic racism in policing, we are talking about patterns of behavior, policies, or practices that are part of the structures of the Toronto Police that contribute to the disparities we see in these reports. That's why the next phase of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's inquiry will include a review of training, a review of policies and procedures, and a review of accountability mechanisms. The Ontario Human Rights Commission will then release a final report that will also include findings from our engagements with Black communities and interviews with senior leaders at the Toronto Police. It will also contain a series of recommendations that the Toronto Police Service, the Toronto Police Services Board, and other policing stakeholders can implement to address anti-Black racism. We are aiming to release our final report by the end of 2020. I'm now going to invite Dr. Scott Wortley to provide more details on his research team's findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to share some of the findings of our most recent analysis of the TPS data. Myself, along with my colleagues, Dr. Ayu Lanianu, Maria Zhang, and Eric Lamming. My comments today only provide a brief snapshot of major report findings. Please consult the report itself for a detailed description of the methodology, the findings, and a discussion, importantly, of data limitations and future research needs. A criminal charge and a possible conviction has many consequences, from temporary detention to punishments including fines, probation, and possible incarceration. Arrests and charges can have a very negative impact on one's life. Even charges that do not involve conviction result in a police non-conviction record, with a potential impact on future employment, housing, education, and volunteer opportunities. Start briefly with a review of the arrest data. Some of the findings have already been reviewed. Our research team looked at 9 different types of charges, including failure to comply with a condition or recognizance, obstruct justice, assault police, uttering threats against police, cannabis possession, other non-cannabis illegal drug possession, out-of-sight driving offenses, including driving without a valid license, driving while suspended, driving without insurance, disturbing the peace, and trespassing. These charges were selected because, compared to most more serious offenses, these types of offenses are more likely to be impacted by either police surveillance practices or police discretion. The more discretion involved, the less closely the charging process is regulated and monitored, and the more opportunity there is for subjective considerations and racial bias to come into play. While Black males represented only 4% of Toronto's population, they were involved in almost a third of all charges collected in the OHRC dataset, with an overall charge rate that was 4.5 times higher than the rate for white males and 7.5 times higher than the rate for males from other racial minority communities. The overall charge rate for Black women was 2.4 times higher than the rate for white women and 6.2 times higher than the rate for women from other racialized groups. There are certain types of single charge cases that may be probative of racial profiling. For example, a single charge out-of-sight traffic, out-of-sight driving offense may be discovered only after the police have observed the race of the driver or stopped and questioned the driver. While black people make up 8.8% of the Toronto's population, they represented a third of single charge cases that were overrepresented, and they were also overrepresented in all 9 charge categories. Charge outcomes, we also examined charge outcomes using the available TPS data. We were not interested in the type or severity of the sentence, only whether the person was sentenced for the charge or not. Overall, the results suggest that half of the charges for all individuals were eventually withdrawn. Only 1 out of every 5 charges laid by the police resulted in a conviction. During the study period, black people were grossly overrepresented in charges that resulted in a withdrawal, a dismissal, an acquittal, and a conviction, suggesting that overcharging is an issue faced by black communities. The use of force reports. The second report I want to talk about is the use of force report. We analyzed incidents that resulted in the serious injury or death or sexual assaults, which are all captured by the SIU's mandate and were presented in a collective impact, and lower level use of force cases that were not captured by the SIU. These lower level incidents may not always get media attention, but they are equally important in understanding the lived experiences of black communities and their interactions with the police. Additional research shows that SIU investigations involving black civilians were more likely to result from proactive rather than reactive policing activities. Over a quarter of cases involving black people resulted from proactive police stops, compared to only 11% of the cases involving white people. By contrast, 60% of the cases involving white people resulted from a civilian call for service, compared to only 47% of cases involving black people. In a collective impact, we found that criminal record or the presence of a weapon did not explain the overrepresentation of black people in SIU cases. In this updated report, we also looked at community-level crime rates. Black people are significantly overrepresented in SIU investigations that took place within both low crime and high crime communities. In fact, the level of overrepresentation in SIU investigation is greater within low crime communities than it is within high crime patrol zones. Another point we want to make has to do with respect to guns and gangs. We often hear from the community that black people must be overrepresented in use of force cases because they are more involved in gang and gun-related crime. Our data challenges this stereotype. Analysis shows that most of the use of force cases involved an unarmed civilian with no previous criminal record who was non-compliant with police commands. Very few cases involve someone in possession of a firearm, and even fewer involve someone who had actually brandished a firearm or actually fired it at a police officer. Many cases, by contrast, involve people in a mental health crisis or were suffering with substance abuse issues. SIU cases, it is important to note, only account for a small percentage of use of force incidents involving the police. That is why it's also important to analyze lower level use of force data, where black people were once again grossly overrepresented. Although they represented only 8.8% of Toronto's population, black people were involved in 40% of the use of force cases documented by the study. The involvement of black males in lower level use of force cases was particularly high. Black males represent only 4% of Toronto's population, but were involved in 34.5% of all lower level use of force cases. Black women were underrepresented in this data set, but their rate of lower level use of force was still 3.6 times greater than white females and 25 times greater than women from other racial backgrounds. Most lower level use of force cases involved either the physical restraint or grounding of somebody, police strikes, including punches or kicks. Only 10% involved police officers pointing their firearm at a civilian. Black people are grossly overrepresented, as the report details, in virtually all lower level use of force categories. Many people believe that police use of force incidents often involve confrontations with violent armed civilians. However, our analysis reveals that, once again, this is not true. 8 out of the 10 lower level use of force cases in the data set involved unarmed civilians. Only 5% involved somebody with a firearm. Even when armed, people rarely used weapons to threaten or assault police and were often discovered after the arrest had been made. We find that there is a positive relationship between patrol zone levels and how often the police resort to lower level use of force. In other words, lower level use of force cases are more likely to happen in high crime than low crime communities. However, Black people are grossly overrepresented in lower level use of force cases that take place in both low crime and high crime patrol zones. Black people are 5.5 times more likely to be involved in a use of force incident that took place in a low crime community than their residents in those communities would predict. The results of our study revealed that Black people were grossly overrepresented in police use of force and arrest incidents. This disparity cannot be explained away by racial differences in criminal history, civilian behavior towards the police at the time of the incident, civilian weapons use, civilian mental illness, civilian intoxication, or local crime rates. Black people were also grossly overrepresented in the charges that were the focus of the OHRC inquiry, and they faced a higher number of charges per arrest incident than their white counterparts. The overall findings in both reports are highly consistent with the argument that due to various forms of conscious, unconscious, and systemic bias, Black people are overrepresented in various types of negative police outcome. The disproportionate impact of TPS practices on Black people warrants significant reform, including the development of a system of race-based, research-oriented data collection, analysis, and analysis that is available to the public. The research team, finally, intends to continue to consult with the OHRC to develop various policy recommendations, which the OHRC will release in its final report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wortley. Black communities affected by the actions of police in Toronto have played an ongoing role in our inquiry since its beginning. We continue to rely on their perspectives and their lived experience to guide our efforts. This morning, we've invited two members of Black communities to share their thoughts. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Anthony Morgan, who will be joining us remotely. Anthony.
Greetings, folks. As was noted, my name is Anthony Morgan. I'm the manager of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit and also a racial justice lawyer in the city. I'd like to start by commending the Ontario Human Rights Commission and all who are involved in the research, writing, analysis, and community engagement processes that have led to the development of these two interim reports. Now, considering Toronto's Black communities and our allies in the decades-long struggles to address and eliminate direct and systemic anti-Black racism in policing, it's sad to say that none of the findings in these reports are a shock or really a surprise. These reports essentially repackage what Black individuals, families, and communities have hurtfully known and painfully experienced since at least August 1978, when Buddy Evans was killed by Toronto police, which was followed by the August 1979 killing of another Black man by Toronto police, Albert Johnson. These killings of Black Torontonians accelerated a tradition of Black community advocacy against brutality and for greater police accountability in the city. Toronto-based Black Action Defense Committee, though not alone, led much of this advocacy starting in the late 1970s. Following the Black Action Defense Committee, a new generation of advocates emerged, most visibly in the form of Black Lives Matter Toronto. The community organizing and public agitation of the Black Action Defense Committee led to the 1988 establishment of the Toronto Race Relations and Policing Task Force. This task force eventual report, published in 1989, was instrumental in leading the province of Ontario to reform and restructure policing through the adoption of new legislation, namely the Police Services Act. The Police Services Act included the creation of the Special Investigations Unit, an unsatisfactory and so far unsuccessful attempt to respond to the calls from Black communities for independent police oversight in this province and for greater police accountability. Since the task force report, there has been the 1995 report on the Commission of Systemic Racism in the Ontario criminal justice system, and more recently, there was the 2017 report of the Independent Police Oversight Review by Justice Tulloch. Several other critical reports responding to the disproportionately high levels of victimization of Black people by police violence have been commissioned, written, and released. Yet still, Black communities remain disproportionately impacted in incidents of racial profiling, police contact, and police use of force, especially use of lethal force. With this in mind, Toronto's Black communities and our allies can't be faulted for responding to this morning's release by stating, quote, "We don't need another report," end quote. We don't need another report restating troubling truths about the harmful and deadly consequences of anti-Black racism in policing. We don't need another report showing us that if you're Black, young, living in a socioeconomically disadvantaged community, or living with mental health issues, that you're at far greater risk of being seriously injured or killed by the very people ostensibly tasked to serve and protect you. And it's true. We don't need another report, as in Black communities and their allies don't need this. As the saying goes, who feels it knows it. So it's important that we avoid pretending that these reports are primarily for Black people and those who support our rights for equality, dignity, and freedom. These reports are primarily for the politicians, public policymakers, judges, Crown lawyers and prosecutors, parole board members, probation officers, and others in positions of power within the systems of policing and justice. Systems which these new reports show to be continuing to produce outcomes that create the impulses for the Black Lives Matter movement in the city of Toronto, in this country, and indeed across the world. That these reports are not primarily for Black people is not to say that these reports aren't exceptionally important. They are. They're exceptionally important because they take what Black communities have known, felt, and experienced for far too long and translated them into forms and content that speak to the systems of power that continue to produce so much Black pain, physically and figuratively. These reports create better policy conditions and impetus for policy change. That matters. When new policies, procedures, and/or legislation are being developed, these reports matter. Or when judges are making decisions, reports like this matter. Consider, for instance, how many within Black communities and among allies felt after the verdicts came down related to the Devontae Miller case. Reports like these, released today, are the very evidence decision makers rely on as a basis to make decisions that are in sync with the voices and experiences of the Black communities that inform them. And so it is my sincerest hope that Black communities and leaders across the city will find ways to take up these reports, speak about them, write about them, take the information in them into the spaces where we organize, gather, and discuss ways to create better conditions for our communities. Because while the reports are primarily for power brokers of the policing and justice systems, whether they translate into real and true change will largely be determined by the degree to which these reports are aggressively leveraged to create the conditions that our Black communities have long required and wanted to see for us.
Thank you, Anthony. I would now like to introduce Charmaine Hall for our next speaker.
Good morning. I'm honored to be here today to share a few remarks. Chief Commissioner, OHRC staff, Dr. Wortley, thank you for this very important report. Discrimination based on race is one of the most common grounds of discrimination in our client's human rights application. And anti-Black racism remains a particularly virulent form of racism. I can tell you that our work at the Human Rights Legal Support Center has demonstrated that racial profiling has profound, lasting, and damaging impacts on our clients. In the past 12 years, the center has provided legal help in response to inquiries from Black individuals who have been stopped by police with no apparent reason. These have included allegations of motor vehicle stops, which have at times resulted in out-of-sight driving charges, as noted in the OHRC report, and random incidents where Black individuals simply walking down the street were stopped, questioned, and sometimes even detained. Many of the individuals who contact our office will seek redress for anti-Black police conduct. Many more have come to accept this as a daily reality for Black people in Toronto and choose to take no action, hoping that there will not be a next time. We know the profound personal impact anti-Black racism has. Those who are victims feel hurt, they feel devastated, they feel angry and humiliated. There is a deep-rooted damage to their sense of dignity and self-respect. Furthermore, we have heard from our clients that anti-Black racial profiling has lasting impact on an individual's educational pursuits, employment opportunities, and housing situations, not to mention the deep-seated distrust of those who are sworn to protect and serve all communities. The status quo cannot be maintained. We cannot thrive as a society when certain communities face barriers that prevent them from reaching their full potential. To be sure, the HRLSC will continue to assist individuals who allege anti-Black discrimination against law enforcement. However, to combat the insidiousness of racial profiling, what is required is more than a series of case-by-case legal battles. Legal challenges will always be part of the solution. But battling systemic discrimination must include systemic solutions, proposals, strategies, and reforms. To bring about societal transformation, we must be prepared to tackle the root causes of anti-Black racism if we are to achieve long-term systemic change. The findings of the Commission's second interim report is a statistical wake-up call with the potential to address anti-Black racism in the TPS head-on. In my professional life, I hold a few titles: lawyer, executive director. But in my personal life, one of my most important titles is mother to two incredible young men. My eldest is 20, the younger boy is 13. Our family calls Toronto home. So this issue is important to me on a professional and personal basis. In June, as I was preparing for a meeting with the HRLSC staff, a meeting in which I planned to discuss George Floyd's death, I was struggling with how I would approach the horror the world had witnessed. I read my 13-year-old the remarks I had written. He didn't like it. He suggested I use the poem that he had written and submitted as part of a poetry assignment. He's given me permission to share a few lines with you. One line in his poem reads, "The risk of Black men being killed is absurd." Another reads, "This is very scary to me. My brother is a young man. This can happen to him." Yet another reads, "I feel that a meeting should be hosted to address the solution to this problem." A few things struck me about my son's poem. First, I had no idea that he was thinking so deeply about these issues. Of course, our household had discussions about Floyd's death and the subsequent righteous protests that followed, but I didn't realize it had moved my son to write about it. Second, I was struck by his concern for his brother. Concern obviously born out of love, but I was angered that my 13-year-old worried about such things. He shouldn't have to. Third, I was moved by his suggestion that dialogue was necessary to appropriately address anti-Black police conduct. It seemed simple. What my son didn't know was there had been discussion after discussion, report after report, that had not resulted in significant substantive change. The OHRC's second interim report, is a timely document based on the TPS's own data that reflects the allegations made by many in Toronto's Black communities. It is an important document with calls to action that, if pursued, can affect long-term systemic change that is sustainable. Change that has been too long in coming, and change that is necessary for all of us who live here. Change that is especially necessary for young people of all races to thrive. The HRLSC fully supports the Commission's report and calls to action. We look forward to the next phase of the OHRC's inquiry. Chief Commissioner, once again, thank you to all those who have worked on this report.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. That concludes the formal part of the news conference. I now want to call on the speakers in the studio to come up onto the podium to answer questions, and ask Anthony Morgan if you would please stand by for media questions. For the media, I would ask you to use the chat function to kind of raise your hand to say that you have a question, and I'll call on you and we'll unmute you to ask your question. Thanks very much.
Hi, this is John Chidley Hill from the Canadian Press. My question would be for the interim chair. I'm curious, you mentioned having recommendations for the Toronto Police Service as well as the province. I was curious if you could give sort of a timeline that you'd like to see those changes implemented in.
Thank you so much for your question. Our timeline will first be commenced with discussions and further consultations with the Black communities and the other stakeholders. There is still work to be done with this inquiry, and I'm actually going to ask our Executive Director, Raj Dheer, to tell you a little bit more about the next steps of the inquiry, which will give you a better sense of when the consultations with respect to legislative reform will commence.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner Chadha. I spoke earlier about some of the next steps that we are taking as part of the final report for our inquiry. Some of those steps will include conducting further analysis by Dr. Wortley on survey data on perceptions of bias and data related to street checks. It will also include interviews with Toronto Police senior leadership, and responses from the Toronto Police Services Board, a review of policies and procedures and accountability measures, and a summary of our engagements with Black communities. As part of those engagements with Black communities, we are also looking at hearing their perspectives on what steps can be taken to address racial profiling and systemic racism and anti-Black racism in policing. And so that process is occurring simultaneously with the work that is towards our final report. In the meantime, I think we're quite open to engaging in discussions with the Toronto Police Service, Toronto Police Services Board, and communities in relation to our calls to action.
Thank you. May I ask a follow-up, if that's okay? This question's for Ms. Hall or Mr. Morgan. You were both supportive of this report, but I was curious, were there any areas that you found lacking or any areas you'd like to see further explored?
Charmaine, do you want to start?
I think that what I hope to see happen with this report is what is contemplated in the next phase. I really do believe that what is necessary is to engage Black communities so that what the end result is one that that's informed by the community's lived experiences, by the pardon me, by the community's feeling in terms of what the outcomes should be. Dr. Wortley has done an incredible job. The Commission has done an incredible job. But really, this report is one that will hopefully address the issue of anti-Black police conduct head-on. And the only way to do so is to engage Toronto's Black communities.
And Mr. Morgan?
Yeah, I would echo the same. At this point, I wouldn't say there's necessarily anything that's lacking. I think it's what I'm thinking about and thinking with respect to the work of the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit and just being a member of Toronto's Black communities. It's what translates after. So as Charmaine noted, engagement with Black communities, and then at the end of the day, accountability. As I've said in different contexts, we don't have a information problem. We have an accountability problem when it comes to policing within the city. And so at the end of the day, public policymakers, decision makers, politicians, and especially actors within the policing and justice system being held accountable for the ways in which Black people are overrepresented within rates of police contact, racial profiling, police use of lethal force is what will ultimately determine how valuable or useful this report is, or these reports are, I should say.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we have another question. I'm just going to remind if reporters would please identify themselves and their organization before they ask the question. That'll be helpful to us. Adam Carter. We'll unmute
It's
you.
from CBC Toronto. And this is a question for Mr. Morgan. You mentioned earlier that you've seen so many reports of this nature. Is there something about this one or the state of the world at the moment that you think might let it affect real, tangible change?
That's a good question. I think we're having, as far as my reading and understanding goes, an unprecedented level of public conversation, specifically on anti-Black racism. Historically, the trend has been, especially in Canada, to pivot towards conversations about racism more generally, or talk about race relations, or equity, inclusion, diversity, or unconscious bias, as opposed to being forthright and direct and saying, no, what we're talking about is anti-Black racism. And so I think there's a prospect for change here that is new. And also looking at what happened with the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in R v. Lee just last year, which as was noted by interim chief commissioner, that the Supreme Court of Canada looked at the first iteration of this report, the first interim report, A Collective Impact, and cited it as exceptionally authoritative And so I would be surprised if after the Supreme Court of Canada used this report in part to speak to the ills and problematics of racial profiling and carding specifically, if it does not translate into further change as it relates to police contact and police engagement with members of Black communities. And so because that significant precedent has been set, I'm anticipating that other courts and other justice actors will be responsive to this report.
Thanks very much.
Wendy Gillis, Toronto Star.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you very much for taking my question. This question is for Dr. Wortley. I wondered, Dr. Wortley, if you wouldn't mind explaining the importance of incorporating American comparisons into this work. And secondly, if you were surprised by the finding, which of course is that Black Torontonians are in fact more likely than Black Americans to be shot by police.
I'd say the overall rates are about equally likely. They're just the differences are slight, so it's probably more accurate to say that Black Torontonians are equally likely to be shot and killed by the police as Black Americans. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important finding, and when we were looking at the analysis, is that talking about issues of race and racial bias, to a white Canadian audience, often you're given the response that, well, it's not as bad a problem here as it is in the United States. We comfort ourselves by, stating that these issues may be a little problem in Canada, but they're a big problem south of the border. And I think what the data that we've been producing, not only on use of force, not only on criminal justice outcomes, but outcomes in education, outcomes in employment, outcomes in a number of other life indicators, strongly suggests that anti-Black racism in particular, anti-Indigenous racism, are just as much problems here in Canada as they are in other jurisdictions, and we need to start taking these issues much more seriously than we traditionally have. We can no longer be placated by the American comparison.
Very much.
All right. We have a next question from Fazia Amin from City News.
What's that?
It's coffee. It's the mocha yogurt.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Hi, this is Fiza with City News. Thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to know if Toronto Police and the TPS board received this report. Would you say that the force has been responsive in participating in these recommendations?
I'm listening to this news conference and I've put out my first story.
Excuse me, whoever
So
is...
it's just a short one and then I'll update it. But
Sorry,
I'm on the board.
I think someone is unmuted speaking about their short story.
All right. I apologize, Fazia. You can please ask your question again.
Thank you. I just wanted to know if Toronto Police and the TPS board received this report. Would you say that the force has been responsive in participating in this inquiry as well as anticipating these recommendations set to come down?
I can tell you that the Toronto Police Service Board and the Toronto Police have, as well as the city, have been briefed. We briefed them this week, as well as have worked with them in collecting the data. At least our legal team has worked with them for over a month now, at minimum, in briefing them as to how the progress of the inquiry was going. I can tell you that the Toronto Police Services Board, the Toronto Police, and Mayor John Tory have expressed interest in exploring process, and they've confirmed also interest in engaging with community. But at this juncture, they have not committed to meeting the Commission's first call to action for legally enforceable, binding, broad remedies. While they've spoken about engagement and while they've spoken about and have committed to working along with us and in collaboration, ultimately what we're looking for are legally binding remedies. And we say that the community deserves no less than that. I think that that process will continue, those dialogues will continue, and as I've said, we will be looking for community engagement to help us inform our dialogues with the Toronto Police Services Board and with the city.
Thank you. Is it okay if I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Thank you. We often do hear about inquiries and investigations and reports coming in about anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. And so oftentimes there's some sort of frustration that there's a lack of action, and we're continuously in the department of conducting these inquiries and investigations. I'd like to hear from the speakers here today if this is the type of report that is going to incite action down the line.
Charmaine, would you start?
I think this is, pardon me, I think this is an opportunity for the Toronto Police Services Board, the Toronto Police, the City of Toronto, and also the province to certainly get behind this report and move forward. As I said in my earlier remarks, action has been too long in coming. We have seen changes, and as Anthony mentioned earlier, the discussions are far more than I have seen in recent times. This is an opportunity to act, and I would ask that the powers that be seize the opportunity and come to the table, work with community, work with the OHRC to finally effect sustaining change.
If I may add to that, I don't know if I can be heard. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Anthony.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. One thing I want to note, of course, as I mentioned in the outset of my remarks, the manager of the City of Toronto is confronting anti-Black racism unit. And while there have been previous reports, so this also answers the previous question that was asked, I think, by the Canadian press. While there have been previous reports, there have been previous studies and outcomes, the conditions are different. And one of the structural conditions that have never existed before is confronting anti-Black racism unit that has specific commitments that are not, they're articulated as recommendations, but because they have been adopted by City Council, are now obligations of the City of Toronto and the agencies that signed on to the actions and the recommendations and actions in the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism, which was unanimously adopted by City Council in December 2017. So I have the privilege, honor, and pleasure to lead that team in moving forward with the implementation of those recommendations and actions. And within the action plan itself, there are at least 13 pieces that speak very directly to police reform, and so requires an engagement with the Toronto Police Service. And what comes out of these two interim reports and the previous report, A Collective Impact, is part of the ways in which we engage the Toronto Police Service and the Toronto Police Services Board towards realizing greater equity for Black communities and better outcomes for Black communities. So again, while there have been many moments like this before, what hasn't existed before simply is an action plan to confront anti-Black racism as a city, and a team that is fully staffed to work full-time on addressing this. And so with that, I think there's a greater prospect and conditions for change. Not to say that it can happen alone. No city office or division has ever proven itself able to resolve any issue of anti-Black racism, but critically at the level of city levers and infrastructure for change, that exists where it didn't exist before. And so we're looking forward to working with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, our partners within the city, and then also, of course, the Toronto Police Services and the Toronto Police Services Board to make sure that this is not a report that sits on the shelf, but actually translates into real change.
Thank you.
Just to add, on one recommendation that has been long-standing is for the collection, dissemination, and analysis of race-based data. 25 years ago, I was a PhD student and a researcher with the Commission on Systemic Racism, and that was one of the strongest recommendations put forward. It's been 25 years, and we're only now beginning to discuss about developing plans and implementing race-based data collection. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this is going to be an important breakthrough that's going to help us better understand these phenomena, better understand the extent of racial disparities in the justice system, not only within policing, but through the courts and corrections as well. And that it's going to help us better understand why those disparities emerge and what we can do to address them. And importantly, we need data. This study might serve as a good benchmark to evaluate whether the forthcoming, consultations and recommendations and anti-racism initiatives that are implemented are going to make a difference. I'm sure we'll hear about additional training in police services. Does that training contribute to greater confidence in the police? Does that training reduce the racial disparities that we've observed with respect to so many policing and justice outcomes? So cautiously optimistic, particularly because there seems to be overtures at various levels of government to committing towards that data collection framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wortley. Tashana Reed from CBC News.
Hi there. Thanks to all the speakers today. Actually, I think, Scott, you might, maybe this is a follow-up because my question was related to that second call of action on establishing, a provincial mandate that police collect and analyze this race-based data. Are there any existing examples in Canada where this is currently being done or has been done? And what do you think that could look like if it were to be implemented?
It's a great question. I think there's only been, to date, kind of piecemeal overtures. There's been pilot projects. I mean, even the data that we analyzed in this project was not originally collected with research outcome and evaluation in mind. It was primarily administrative data collected by the police for their enforcement activities. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The Ontario government and its anti-racism directorate has developed guidelines and a framework for collecting this data. I do think it has to be consistently applied across all regions in the province and hopefully all regions of Canada so we can examine the impact of data. And it needs to extend, the justice system doesn't operate in silos. There's strong connections between what happens in policing and what happens in show cause hearings, what happens in courts and what happens in corrections. And we need to start systemically collecting data at all stages here. But I'm optimistic, but following the general framework that has been put together by the Anti-Racism Directorate would be a really good place to start.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Jim Rankin, Toronto Star.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? It's a question for the Commission. I'm just curious to know what involvement, if any, did Randall Arsenault have in the release of the interim report?
Commissioner Arsenault has been respecting the conflict of interest guidelines that the Integrity Commissioner and my predecessor have set the parameters around corrections and criminal justice and law enforcement and policing. And so he has not participated in this inquiry or been involved in the release of this information.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up again for the Commission. Do you have any sense if there'll be any more appointments made anytime soon? I know you're down quite a few commissioners.
Well, I'm so happy you asked me that question, Jim, because it gives me an opportunity to tell you that we are one of three pillars. And as you may know, I was formerly the chair of the Human Rights Legal Support Center and had the great honor of working with Charmaine Hall. Charmaine Hall and I had a very productive relationship with the Ministry of the Attorney General. In that regard, from January until the springtime, we had 4 successful nonpartisan appointments of very competent and dedicated citizens of Ontario. I took this role with the priority to rebuild the Commission's panel, and I can tell you I'm actively pursuing that priority, and I've had those discussions with the Minister's office, and the Commission and the 3 pillars are vibrant, important, integral components of our province, and the government knows that I will do everything I can do to sustain this system, build the system, and push the system forward.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. That's all I have.
Are there any more questions from media? I'll give you about a minute to respond through the chat function if you have any more questions. All right, we're going to call this news conference to a close. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good day. Bye-bye.